last part of the lecture for this section is on putting all of these things together. So we played the portfolio game, and we've been playing this for the last couple lectures, which is what combination of or what combination of companies would we be happy with for our own portfolio. And we usually end up with a graph that looks something like this. So we have standard deviation, we have expected returns, we have these four companies. I just kind of picked where the spot would be. This is probably the internet startup. This is probably the grocery store. Maybe these are manufacturing. And then we have this one thing that I'm adding, which is the risk-free asset, oftentimes a 10-year treasury, could be any of those things. This is not an accurate representation because right now the risk-free asset is almost zero because of the Fed rate cuts and all the stuff that's been happening in the economy. But anyway, the point is, usually when it's drawn, it's placed about right here. There are some assets, and they are scattered across the board. Recall from the last lecture, I just copied this in. We had different portfolios that we could form based on those. And those portfolios lie in different parts of the graph. Therefore, there are portfolios that can lower our risk and give us about the same return. We're going to come back to that. What happens is, in the finance literature, we have all of these individual risky assets, and we can combine them into a portfolio. And what it does is create an opportunity set. And the opportunity set is usually done, here it's a blue curve, but it's usually a line, and it looks like this. And so we cannot achieve anything that is outside of this. The variance and covariance of the different assets will not allow it. If you notice here, the closest that we could get would be like 5%. But that's the closest that we could get. There's nothing that's out here and above. Some of these, like in theory, we could be less efficient. But what we want to do is, for our level of risk that we're comfortable with, so let's say that I'm comfortable with risk that's about right here, I want to get as close to the top of the opportunity set as I can. In fact, I want to be on the opportunity set. And I want to do that by combining the assets into a portfolio that I think is useful. This is the minimum variance portfolio. So this is standard deviation on the x-axis. The minimum variance is literally the portfolio that has the minimum amount of variance. And that makes sense because it is entirely on the left side of this curve. So this is also called the efficient frontier, and this is the minimum variance portfolio. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways to think about this. This is one of the examples. You have a bunch of different stocks and covariances and correlations. And here's what your options look like with just these three stocks. If you construct a bunch of portfolios, which Professor Hall did, you get 66 portfolios. They weight from 0 to 100% in 10% increments. Then you have essentially what looks like the opportunity set that is on this page and on the prior pages. This represents the best you can do. Would you ever invest in this portfolio down here, like this dot where my mouse is hovering? No, because for similar return and only a teensy bit more risk, you could invest in, for only a teensy bit more risk, you could invest in this portfolio. Similarly, you would not invest in this portfolio. For a similar amount of risk, you could invest in that one and get more return. So the idea is, no matter who you are, you're going to push either up or to the left on this curve. So for the same amount of risk, I can get the return that is at the top of the curve. And what happens is these green portfolios emerge. These are the portfolios that we care about, and these are the ones that we would want to invest in if we had a particular level of risk. So for instance, if I only wanted a risk of 15%, I would only invest in the green portfolio. I would not invest in any of these red dots because they have lower expected return according to the y-axis here. What's interesting about this whole thing is that when you are investing in these portfolios, you are diversifying your risk. And a lot of you have heard of that and know the term. But what happens is, as you invest in, so if you invest in one stock, you inherit the variance from that one stock. So your variance could be very, very high. As you invest in additional stocks, so for each one stock that you invest in, your diversification increases and your variance goes down. So eventually, as you get to the entire universe of stocks, what you end up with is only the non-diversifiable risk. So you can diversify away everything until you reach a certain point, and then you just have the leftover risk that is just sort of life. It's what's in the market. You can't get away from it. It is your only option in terms of how to your only option in terms of investing. So if you want to invest money, you automatically inherit the systematic risk, and it is completely non-diversifiable. There's nothing you can do with it. There is a set amount of risk for investing in every single market. And before I stop this video, I want to show you this really interesting thing that Professor Hall did. So he took 29 stocks from the Dow Jones Industrial Average. He selects the largest company and does one portfolio. And then he does, and here's the actual thing. So he weights, the largest stock is Microsoft. So he selects one and does Microsoft at 100%. He runs another portfolio with Apple and Microsoft at 50-50. Another one with Microsoft, Apple, and Johnson & Johnson. And he does that all the way out until he's done 29 portfolios. So notice that there are columns missing here. It's just, this is to show you what it looks like. When you do that, when you look at your return on those portfolios, you find that the number of assets lowers your risk. And while, it lowers your risk. So, but it only lowers it so much. So you only get down to 14%. You never ever go below a certain amount because you always have the systematic risk that is inherent in investing in companies and investing in anything, basically. So the message here is that when you're at one company, you have a lot of risk. As you do two companies, it goes down, three, it goes down, and eventually you get to where you don't have that much of a reduction in risk. Diversification doesn't help you that much. So in a nutshell, high covariance means that assets move together, and it's harder to get a free lunch. So for instance, if you had two of these stocks that were super highly correlated, let's say, well, Apple and Microsoft are pretty highly correlated, but even the diversification from that is helpful. But if they were 100% correlated, diversification would do nothing for you, and you would therefore not have any benefit from it. As soon as they stop being 100% correlated, diversification helps you. High covariance, diversification is not as helpful. Low covariance, diversification helps you a lot. And finally, we can never get rid of systemic risk. So no matter what you do, you always have the risk in the market. And we actually see that in the news today. There is just a certain amount of risk that everyone faces, and there's nothing that you can do to get rid of that by buying other companies or whatever. You have to carry that when you invest.